Now, hello everyone. Welcome to the YouTube channel of me, David Chen. We're here to discuss Loki. Joining me today is Dan Gvozden from the Amazing Spider Talk podcast. Dan, thanks for joining me today. How are you doing, man?
I'm doing all right. I can't believe we're halfway through this show already.
It seems like just 3 weeks ago that we started doing this YouTube recap show about Loki, and that's because that's roughly about the time that we did do that.
No, 2 weeks ago.
2 weeks ago. Geez, time just flies and also is extremely slow. So here's what we're doing here at youtube.com/davechensky. We are broadcasting live every single week and talking about the latest episode of Loki. We're going to spoil everything through this week's episode of Loki, nothing from future week's episodes. We might speculate on comic book stuff and what might happen in the future. If we do that, we'll try to demarcate that in the show and say like this is from comic book knowledge, but when we draw from knowledge of like casting and stuff, we'll indicate that as well. So we'll try to give warning, but in general we're just spoiling everything through this week's episode. I do also want to call out that while this video podcast is available for free at youtube.com/davechensky, if you want a higher quality audio version, all you got to do is go to patreon.com/davechen, join the roughly 500 people there who are supporting my work and making my work possible. Thank you so much if you're a patron at patreon.com/davechen and you're listening to this Loki recap in podcast form. Also want to give a shout out to Dan Gvozden's Amazing Spider Talk podcast at amazingspidertalk.com. Check it out if you're into comic book stuff and specifically Spider-Man comic book stuff.
Lots of exciting stuff going on in the world of Spider-Man right now, too. They just are announcing a new creative team on the comic. So if you're interested in jumping on the title, come join us over on the podcast and get all caught up on what's going on in his world.
Amazing. And I just want to say I'm very grateful to have the kind of community that we have on here on the YouTube channel, like the Tunes In Live. It's not always a guarantee that people will show up if you broadcast live. And every week there's always like engaged people who chime in with some really fun and interesting comments, and we'll be calling them out and putting some of their comments on screen during the course of this broadcast. I'll be reading it in the podcast as well. So thank you so much to those of you who show up here and comment. And speaking of comments, why don't we address a comment from last week's episode, Season 1, Episode 2 of Loki. What was the title of that one, Dan Gvozden? Do you remember that one?
Oh my gosh! On the drop here.
Was it Glorious Purpose?
No, that
That
was
was
the
the
first
first one.
episode.
The Variant.
The
Yes.
variant. That makes a lot of sense. That seems like so long ago. Like we've just moved well past that thinking.
Pen and Paper said, I agree about the Minutemen and would go further that they don't seem well-trained or disciplined. They seem like if you gave advanced cutting-edge Pentagon weaponry to Paul Blart Mall Cop. This was in reference to a comment you made, Dan Gvozden, about how you felt that the weaponry that the TVA foot soldiers were given was extremely powerful, given their seeming level of skill with it, right?
Right.
Like you theoretically, you don't want to give kind of lower level henchmen essentially world altering abilities.
Yeah. Well, you don't want to give Paul Blart Mall Cop a bazooka. Like it would not work out well.
Indeed. So Pen and Paper definitely agreed with you. Thanks to all the people who comment. Also, Mr. Moonlight in the chat just says, you guys were the only reason I watched Falcon and Winter Soldier. For that, Mr. Moonlight, I am deeply sorry. Okay, let's get to this week's episode. All right, so we're going to spoil this week's episode, Season 1, Episode 3, entitled Lamentis, after the moon/moon colony that's depicted in this episode. Dan Gvozden, let's talk about overall thoughts on Season 1, Episode 3, Lamentis. This is a short episode. It's like less than 40 minutes, I think, prior
Yeah.
to credits. So
I couldn't believe it when it ended. I was like, oh, wait, that's the ending. But I feel like that's how I felt on like kind of all of these episodes so far. It's just kind of like when it ends, I'm kind of shocked that it's ending, maybe because I'm having such a good time. But they've got some pretty solid cliffhangers. It almost feels like we're right in the middle of a scene that we just kind of cut out. But yeah, the 40-minute runtime I think was especially noticed here, and this episode I appreciate just how focused this show is, and so focused that it doesn't feel the need to kind of linger around. It's kind of got one purpose. Like especially in this episode, they're moving towards a goal, and it just stays focused on that. There's no cutaways. We've left Mobius behind, um, and yet we're like pushing forward into even grander visions. This is kind of the strangest bottle episode ever made, in that it's still huge in scope and yet feels kind of like, I wouldn't say cheap, but like it's in its own kind of like pocket side story, but nevertheless still kind of moving forward with the themes. Did you get a kind of bottle feel out of this episode?
I had that same reaction. I don't know how much of this show was produced during COVID. But I sensed that parts of it were at least like there was stories last year of production being shut down, right? So I assume that at some point between last March and now they had to resume production, and so parts of it were shot during COVID, and I almost kind of got that vibe from it, where both in terms of like last week's episode and this week, like a lot of the scenes are just two characters sitting around and talking, right? And that's like relatively, easier to shoot when you just have like two characters talking for extended periods of time, because you can like test those two people. And obviously there's like dozens of people behind the scenes and everything, but still like you're not like having like tons of crowd shots. Then of course there is the final sequence in the episode where I'm like, oh, I guess they didn't save that much money on this episode after all, right?
Yeah, no,
So
that ending is really amazing. And I read this interview with the showrunner who suggested that like Before Sunrise was an inspiration to the series, and I guess up until now I had thought that they were referring to the Mobius Loki discussions, but like this episode is really in that vein of Before Sunrise, the two characters walking and talking and discussing philosophy and things like that, and
yeah.
there's almost a kind of like weird romance to this, even though you don't want to see Loki kiss himself.
I was curious if that's where this was going.
I mean, there were many instances where I was like, "Are they really going to do this?"
Yes.
And the answer
it would
is
be
no,
bold
but
and transgressive, I think, right?
I think so, but I don't know if Marvel is the place for like, I don't know what you would call that, like self incest. Is that like masturbation? I don't know.
Yeah, is it masturbation if you're having sex with another corporeal being that is you from another dimension? These are things that the show makes you wonder. I also want to point out, by the way, that Scott Cease is in the chat, the TikTok viral superstar from his IKEA TikToks. Welcome, Scott. Hope you're enjoying the recaps.
I want to get Scott into one of these shows because we had the scene where Captain America went to an Apple store. Like let's get Scott in an IKEA selling stuff to like, I don't know, maybe they need to furnish that boat from Falcon and the Winter Soldier.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Too bad that not as many retailers in this Loki miniseries, unfortunately.
Yeah, no, but there's still time. There's still time.
Let's talk about. Well, I'll give a couple of my overall thoughts on this episode. It's funny, like. We should point out Ryan Arey from Screen Crush is one of the, in my opinion, most talented recappers on the internet. And he draws a lot of connections that I wouldn't have seen. Some of them I don't agree with, but I think he's brilliant and works really fast. And I was thinking to myself as I finished this episode, oh, this is mostly like a filler episode. And then literally the opening of his recap this week is, most of you will probably think this is a filler episode that has no real consequence of the show. But it's actually incredibly critical. So I just thought it was funny that was my initial thought was, here's what I liked about the episode. I always enjoy seeing other worlds in the Marvel universe, right? Like, and I think just anytime a filmmaker needs to put a new world on screen, it's just inherently interesting. They need to put a lot of work into what the people look like, what they dress like, what the overall aesthetic is, production design, those kinds of things. And I just always enjoy seeing that in the Marvel universe because in general, it's pretty creative. It's pretty like striking visually. And that was certainly the case in this episode with Lamentis. So I enjoyed that part. I think the banter and the chemistry between Loki and Sylvie, as she's referred to, in this episode is decent. You know, it's not as good as the banter between Loki and Owen Wilson, and hope we'll get more of that.
I 100% agree.
But it's
I
not. It's
think
not bad. It's definitely better than Falcon and Winter Soldier banter, in my opinion.
yeah,
Just
it's serviceable, but I don't think that they have quite the thing going that Owen Wilson and Tom Hiddleston have.
exactly, 100% agreed. And what else do I enjoy about the episode? I think that I really actually liked the opening of the episode. I thought that was really, really cool. And I thought it portended a more, like the beginning and the ending of the episode I thought were pretty strong overall.
Yeah. But to the stuff in the middle of the episode, I think this is a great example of like the difference between what movies and TV can do in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, right? You couldn't have like a 25-minute, digression of characters like, matching wits with each other, I guess, in a Marvel movie. I mean, you could, but you're probably not going to.
You could, but you're trying to shove
tough
in,
these days.
6 action scenes, 30 minutes of characterization, and then 10 minutes of connections to other movies.
Right, exactly.
Right?
You
There's like
nailed
a
it.
fairly standard template for Marvel films at this point.
That's the formula.
And for TV, they can actually do something that goes beyond that. And I agree with you. Even if this episode didn't like fully connect for me, I respect that it's trying something different. So overall, I thought it was fine. I think it's the weakest episode of the 3 so far. It felt like a lot of table setting to me for like what's to come in future episodes. But
I agree, and I think a lot of that is to do with the fact that Sylvie is so withholding in this episode. It's not truly a match of wits because we don't really know what she thinks or is getting at. And
because
so
they
it
don't
feels
want
very
to.
one-sided.
The show is trying to withhold secrets / plot details from you until the final like probably 2 episodes, right?
Correct.
So she can't be so totally forthcoming. But let's talk about what happens. First of all, let me just say something that tickles me every single time, Dan Gvozden, and we're going to get into the details of the episode now, is whenever they mess around with the opening Marvel logo, like just in some way, whether in terms of color, in terms of what they show there, whether in terms of the music, it just always tickles me. It always tickles me when it happens. And it happens this episode. You have song playing, and you find out you're at this bar on Earth, right? Which is a shock. Like, we have a time variant authority Minute Woman on Earth, and we basically find out that like Sylvie is trying to manipulate her into figuring out how many people are guarding the timekeepers. What were your thoughts on this episode, Dan Gvozden?
Well, I really liked this kind of cold opening, if you will. I love it when they can throw you in somewhere where you're completely caught off guard or you're trying to get your bearings. And, I guess you could see very early that Sylvie is kind of manipulating things. I love the detail that they're talking about brain freezes, and Sylvie can't get a brain freeze because, if she's a Loki, that means she's a frost giant. So like the cold doesn't impact her in the same way. And so she's using that as like a manipulative tool. I thought that was a lot of fun. And you quickly see the kind of curtain pulled back, but it cleared up, I think, like a moment of confusion for me in the previous episode where that kind of character from episode 1 had come back after being kidnapped, and I felt really displaced, and this gave me a little more context for what was going on with all that, what she was trying to get at.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of cool to do it that way too. Like, you can imagine a scenario where like this scene was in last episode, right? And it wouldn't have made as much of an impact. It wouldn't have created the tension and resolution that it feel like it creates placed at the beginning of this episode. And so I appreciated that. Also, interesting that, like, in general, with this episode, this show, and things like Avengers Endgame, it just feels like Marvel is putting in a lot of time into rehabilitating Thor 2: The Dark World as, like, a meaningful piece of work. Like, when I saw Thor 2 for the first time, I thought, like, this was not a very good movie. And then we've seen so many things since then, like Avengers, like a huge subplot in Avengers Endgame, and now this entire miniseries that give the events of Thor 2 like a much greater resonance. You know what I mean? I just think that's a little funny, but Anyway,
I did find it odd that Sylvie was like asking about how many people are guarding the timekeepers, whereas
right.
in the previous episode, like we found that she told them where they were, and that didn't really like that. If she got that information, I don't feel like I really saw her put that to use. Like when she wasn't like counting down the number of guards she had taken out
Yeah.
or anything like that. I feel like there could have been an opportunity there to like have her count down and like maybe knock the last one out before like our Loki shows up and know that she was just that close. It's like you set up the ticking clock but didn't use it for anything.
It's true. I mean, I still am holding out hope that they're gonna reveal the usefulness of that information at some point, or maybe that was just the first question she had, Dan Gvozden,
Oh, you're
and the
right.
later questions were like, "Where are the timekeepers?
Right, right.
What is
That's
the
true.
vessel they're being held at?" Like all kinds of things.
Sure.
So then we find out what happens after the events of last episode, right? Which is that at the end of last episode, they were at the Rocks Cart, which is like basically future Walmart. And Sylvie says, Loki, you come with me if you want to live. And he rushes through, and we find out that the place that she's going to is back to the TVA, which I have to say was a huge letdown in terms of what like. I was thinking, oh, they're gonna go time jumping through all these like crazy worlds or whatever, and no, it's just literally the same location we already saw the first two episodes.
I was disappointed too. I thought we were going to get some kind of like secret layer.
Yeah.
You know, I'll say this about like, and maybe this is not just about the scene, but the episode overall. Like, for a character that seems to have been on the lam from the TVA for so long and has been built up for so much to be this like ultimate badass variant that's outthinking the TVA, like Sylvie doesn't really seem to know all that much or really have like that much of a plan here. And it kind of, I think, largely zaps her of the kind of mystery that she had built up. Like,
Mm-hmm.
for example, here when she breaks into the TVA, she goes to like attack one of the guards and realizes that her powers don't work. And, there's some neat flipping around where she kills a bunch of the guys and does some John Wicky stuff. But,
I guess this is her first time in the TVA though, like in the actual TVA area, right?
well, that's the suggestion, right? That she's not been there before because she didn't know magic doesn't work there, or that she's been there before and things have changed. But like for a character that like I suspected had this master plan, that seems like a pretty basic thing to have an understanding of
Right.
before you go charging in.
And later on in the episode, she hints that like her and the TVA have been involved in some cat and mouse game for quite a long time, right?
Right.
And so it is a bit odd that she doesn't know what's going on. Also, like seeing Loki / Sylvie fight hand to hand, like the action scene was. This first one was pretty cool, and then the next two were kind of okay, but it just felt weird and kind of disappointing because they have like you remember again later in this episode that like they have magic powers, right?
Right.
And so I don't need to see them fighting. I already saw Falcon and Winter Soldier. I already know what what a decent fight scene looks like. I'd rather see them use their magic powers and
but they can't in the TVA.
No, I know, but like later on, like when they're on the train, there's like a fight scene as well.
Oh,
right?
for sure. Yeah. I mean, he does blast a few of them with like green blast.
Why not just consistently
you,
use the green blast is my question. You know what I mean?
I know how much you love when like heroes and villains throw energy bolts at each other.
It's my favorite thing in the world.
Yeah, I'm
it's
sure.
It's the most visually aesthetically pleasing thing. So, yeah, the fighting in the opening scene was kind of cool, and it makes sense that they need to fight because they're in the TVA. But all the other fight scenes, I was kind of like, eh. So there's some cool fight scenes, and then Loki gets his knives back, and then Ravonna Renslayer confronts them, and a fight ensues, and then basically. Before they can be apprehended, Loki takes what we now understand to be a tempad and zaps them into a random pre-programmed location and time, kind of like it's a Garmin, like how you have your favorite location saved on the Garmin, and it's just like, whoop, and then she's like, I can't believe you took me to this apocalypse, the one on Lamentis 1 in 2077. No one survives this one. No one survives this one. So, uh, any thoughts on the stuff that happens before we get to Lamentis, which makes up the rest of the episode?
Not really. I think you covered it all. It's not particularly like full of like new concepts. It's kind of a brief action scene.
Yeah. So then a bunch of information is thrown at you as they're on Lamentis, like this is a really particularly bad apocalypse. You know, in the realms of apocalypses, like this one was particularly bad.
It's like basically Majora's Mask. It's just a moon headed towards the planet.
Yeah, yeah. And then speaking of moon, Dan, is there like a star headed towards your face right now? Because I feel like you're getting progressively shinier and shinier.
Oh, is that true? You know, the sun is peeking through the curtains right
Yeah.
on my face.
Yeah, yeah,
It's
yeah.
particularly bad.
All good. So basically Loki is hiding the tempad because we find a few things. The tempad's running out of battery. That classic horror film trope, the cell phone is out of battery. And Loki grabs it and he's hiding it, and Sylvie is the only person that knows how to recharge it, so therefore they need each other, right? And whatever. As far as plot contrivances go, it's fine. I do want to give you credit, Dan Gvozden. I believe last week did you predict? Did you indicate that her name is Sylvie? Right? Like, remind us why you were right last week.
Well, I had seen this thing online. This was not me creating this. That the character was named Sylvie in the credits of a foreign translation or an overseas version of the episode. So I guess I kind of just took that. But I think the thing
you
I'm
called
gonna
it,
call,
Dan.
I called it. But I think that the thing that I called all the way back in episode 1 is that I said this was either going to be Enchantress or a female Loki. And then the previous episode I said, well, I bet it's going to be an amalgamation of female Loki and Enchantress. And I think that's exactly what it is. This is a Loki that has renounced her Lokidom or Loki ship. I don't know what you want to call it. And she's Sylvie now, but she has the powers of Marvel Comics Enchantress, which is, I guess in her early appearances, she used to enchant people with like kind of seduction powers and take them over and control them. And she even tries to do this to Loki, and he even says, "Stop trying to enchant me." And there's no way that is being thrown around casually. So, I mean, this character is, for all intents and purposes, Enchantress, but whose powers are translated through like the body of a female Loki.
So a few thoughts. First of all, it's cool that basically I think in the MCU they combine comic book characters sometimes, right?
Yeah.
Or they like amalgamate. It's like, hey, we're never going to introduce an Enchantress standalone film, so we might as well just like roll that in with this Loki idea, right? Is how you perceive what's happening, and I think that's cool. Like it's a cool way of like involving these side characters and kind of rewarding longtime fans with Easter eggs without necessarily destroying the fabric of what they're trying to create. Go ahead, Dan. Sounds like you have...
I like how they do this because I think it's like a level of confidence in a way. You have 60 some years of Marvel comics. Well, I guess like Marvel proper next year will be the 60th year of their publications, starting with Fantastic Four. But they have so much content to pull from. Like they could really draw this out much longer, right? They could have done 10 to 15 Captain America movies if that's something they really wanted to do, but instead they take all of these best stories and characters and combine them together and combine other stories into other stories. And to me, that's just kind of a level of confidence. Like, look, we don't need to play this slow. We can craft the best story and we'll move on past Captain America fairly quickly. They could have really like done 5 or 6 Captain America movies. You look at something like Transformers or whatever, you have like 7 Shia LaBeouf movies. I guess he's not in the last 2, but you get what I'm saying.
Well, I think a
like
way in which this has gone wrong is like the DECU, right? Or the DC Comics universe, basically, right? Where I remember, actually, no, I'm sorry, that's not what I'm thinking of. I was actually thinking of Sony's version of Spider-Man as an example.
Oh
Do you
boy.
remember how the Amazing Spider-Man 2 with Andrew Garfield uh, crammed in like all these characters into that movie? There was like Electro, and then there was like was it who
The
was the other bad
Rhino.
guy? Was it Hobgoblin or whatever?
Well, they
Like,
do the Green Goblin and they do the Rhino and they do
yeah,
Electro in that
correct.
movie.
Yeah, they did all three of them in one movie, and then they're like, and by the way, there's going to be like more on the way in the post-credit sequence, and it just that's I think a bad example of like how to do it, right? So I feel like when you're trying to kind of create like put these ideas together, you need to be very subtle and artful about it, and I feel like Marvel does a good job of it because there's no scene in this episode where Sylvie turns to the camera and is like, they used to call me enchantress, like there's nothing like that. Now that scene may happen in the future, but it has not happened yet, and I'm grateful for that. And so I feel like it's very artful the way I admire it quite a bit the way they do it.
Yeah, I mean, I even look at something like Into the Spider-Verse, which has like I think a half dozen villains,
Hmm.
but it doesn't feel the need to kind of like point them out.
Right. Yeah.
And I like that a lot about it, and I hope that this is the progression. Like it sounds like we're getting a Batman movie with Catwoman and the Riddler and the Penguin in it, and it's like we know these characters. Don't bother to introduce them. Just go. Like
Yeah.
and Marvel seems to kind of have that in their blood now. They don't feel like they have to spend time building all these people up. Anyway, the point made.
So they arrive at an abandoned town. Oh, by the way, before we get to that, I want to point out a couple of production design similarities that I felt. First of all, you see the tempad in this episode. And is it just me, or does the tempad look a lot like Microsoft's Zune? did you notice that?
I've never had a Zune, so I couldn't tell you.
I felt like it was very similar to Zune in its look. And speaking of other inspirations, I felt like the train was very like heavily inspired by the Snowpiercer train as well, in terms of like its shape. Like it has this little head that's jutting out, and also it's carrying the remnants of society, and also there's lots of class stratification in it. It's a metaphor for society as a whole, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So I felt like there was a lot of like Snowpiercer inspiration in this episode. So
I will add on to that. I feel like all of the sets in this episode are like repurposed sets from The Mandalorian, just with like a purple hue thrown over them. Like
yeah,
they look very Star Wars, which is kind of interesting because Star Wars has this it's very specific like thing that it's doing. But Marvel as a franchise is just so vast. You could literally fit Star Wars like into a corner of the Marvel universe and no one would bat an eye. But don't give Disney executives that idea because God knows they'll do it.
so they try to break into a shack, but then Sylvie gets blasted, and then Loki turns into the woman's husband, and then he gets blasted as well. This is kind of a weird scene. I guess it was just basically like an exposition scene, right? We're just trying to explain, hey, there's an arc. You should go get on it, but you're probably not going to get on it, right? Or there's a train, I should say, that you should try to get on. Sylvie already has knowledge of the arc on her own, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, it's a weird scene. I mean, I think it's also trying to establish like the two different modes of how these characters would approach
Yeah.
a problem.
Yeah.
Which is interesting, but then it kind of repeats that beat later. So I don't know that we necessarily needed all of that. I did find it interesting that like this woman calls them both like devils, which is something that we can we keep returning to. Remember, think back to episode 1 where there was the devil in the stained glass window, and of course they both have like these horns as part of their costume. I
Yeah.
guess Loki's not wearing his, and I will say Sylvie is inconsistently wearing hers in this episode. Like sometimes she has it on, sometimes she doesn't, and I wonder if it was just a mistake in terms of the costumery, which seems like a big thing to miss. But I found it really awkward. But
And
anyway,
at one point, she takes it off and uses it as a weapon, if I recall correctly.
that
right?
that is true. That is true. So maybe that's it. But I did find it interesting that this woman calls them both devils, which seems to be something we're hitting upon. I'm not saying Mephisto, but there is something to them being called devils.
Well, again, watching the Ryan Airy Screen Crush recap of this one, which I again would recommend, his theory is that the people on this planet Lamentis are Xandarians from Xandar.
Hmm.
And there's like multiple reasons he thinks that, and one of them is like if you look at the writing on all the walls, it's like kind of similar to the squiggly lines on Xandar from Guardians of the Galaxy. And there's other compelling reasons as well. I don't know if you picked up on any of that or if you had any theory.
I'm gonna push back against that a little bit, but I'm not entirely confident in what I'm saying. Is that I thought Xandar was destroyed during the events of the past Avengers movie. Like didn't Thanos show up on Xandar to get the Power Stone and destroy it?
Did that happen before Avengers 1 though?
No, I felt like that happened right before Infinity War.
Right. Well, this show depicts events that happened before.
Right, but they're in the future right now. They're in 2077.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Ryan Airy, I got a bone to pick with you.
Perhaps. But I think another point he made is it's very likely these were not humans because, like, the last episode took place partially in 2055 or whatever, and humans were still on Earth. Like, they didn't look like the humans didn't look like they had developed, intergalactic travel technology yet. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, Loki is a frost giant, and he doesn't seem to be showing any traits of that. So, well,
yeah, I guess it's kind of like, what is Marvel's conception? This is something that I thought would bother you more, Dan Gvozden, is like, what is Marvel's conception of like who these humanoid like creatures are? Are they humans? Are they aliens that happen to speak English, like, but write in alien language? Is there some kind of universal translator that we're hearing all their speak through?
Well, if you're bothered by that, then I would encourage you to not read Marvel comics for the past several decades because, like, everybody looks like a human. There are some alien-looking people, but like, and it's intermittent. Sometimes they speak in a different language. It's that kind of like westernized space thing where, but again, the Marvel, like I think I said last time, which is like if you're hung up on rules, Marvel's not the place for you. It's whatever serves the story best, and this stuff doesn't make me blink for even a second.
All right, so they get on the train, and by imitating, like pretending to be one of the guards of the train, they get on the train, and it's very much like the Snowpiercer train in the sense that like there's poor people desperate to get onto it, but then once you get on, it's like, wow, it's a whole different world of rich people that are on the train, and some minor kind of social commentary there. Then they have like a fairly extended conversation about a great many things. And in our show notes, Dan Gvozden, you've hit on kind of some of the key highlights. Can you run through some of these for us?
Yeah, sure. So first they end up talking about like their mothers. Sylvie is kind of the one asking most of the questions, or Loki at least is volunteering a lot of this information. So he talks about his mother Frigga and growing up with her, and Sylvie admits that she can't remember her own mother. And I'll say one of the big things from this is like Sylvie's past, I think, is going to become very important. They talk about like defining love, maybe love is hate, and get into their kind of romantic history. Loki admits for the first time in the MCU to being bisexual, which is something that a lot of people were looking forward to. And I think it's pretty cool that it, is kind of addressed in this way. And, they get discussed like, is love hate? Is love mischief? And ultimately arrive at like, love is a dagger in a really, really tortured monologue, which they admit to being tortured. So I like that quite a bit.
Well, don't you know that bad writing becomes good if you point out that it's bad, Dan?
Yeah, but I actually thought that this was like kind of already like the whole conversation is that all of their metaphors are bad. So I'll give this one a pass.
Also, Sylvie references how she had a relationship with a postman. And at first I thought this was a joke, but then she kind of continued on with it as though it were real. And again, some credit to Ryan Airy for this, but his theory is that she's referring to Stan Lee from the MCU. Like, there's this whole theory that Stan Lee, in all his cameos, is like the same dude who's kind of like visiting different points in time, and that's the person that she had the relationship with. Because
That is interesting.
he's
I
shown at
did
one
not
point
see
being a
that.
FedEx driver, and so like that would be the postman.
Got it. I did not see his video, but I think that's really clever. I thought it was more just kind of like a joke about the movie The Postman. Um,
I don't think
do you know
so.
what I'm? Do you know what I'm referring to?
I don't think that Sylvie has seen the 1997 Kevin Costner post-apocalyptic 3-hour sci-fi film The Postman. Unfortunately,
But she specifically said it's like a postman in the apocalypse. Like that's literally what that movie is.
wow.
I'm both half serious and half joking.
So
But
you're saying Kevin Costner's 1997 post-apocalyptic sci-fi film The Postman takes place in the MCU, according to you?
I am suggesting that, yes. No,
Well,
I don't know if
it's preposterous for the simple reason that he has a love interest in that film.
well, maybe it's Sylvie just transformed in a different look.
Wow. Okay. I'm not going to fault you for this.
I am not really serious about it, but that's just like I didn't know where else to draw that line.
Mm-hmm,
Like that he thinks it's Stan Lee, that's better than anything I could come up with. But I'm sure we're gonna find out. I don't know. It is a weird throwaway line, yeah, or maybe not throwaway.
Maybe not throwaway. We'll find out. All right. So then the train cops show up, and there's a big fight. And again, we've already talked about how the fight was a little bit disappointing because you have people that have literal magical powers, and they're fighting hand-to-hand combat. And so it's kind of a letdown. Like, why aren't we seeing them use their powers?
Get beat.
Yeah. Yes. They get beat.
I did want to say before this fight, there's a really interesting scene where Loki is presumably drunk and singing and dancing, but he's singing in Asgardian. The language he's singing is Asgardian. And I don't know what your interpretation of this was, but like looking at it, it seemed to me like he was saying things that Sylvie didn't understand so as to test if she actually knew Asgardian. And that he wasn't as drunk as he suggests there, that he's kind of manipulating her in a way to test her. Because she calls him out for being like a clown later on, but I don't think that Loki is just a clown. Like, if he's clowning, it's with purpose. And I think there's some manipulation going on here. And maybe he's peeling back that maybe Sylvie isn't who she seems to be. But I don't really know where to go with that. Did you interpret that at all the same?
No, I didn't pick up on that at all. But every major prediction you've made so far has been correct. So I can go with that, Dan. I can go with that.
You're going with this a lot faster than the Postman prediction.
100%.
Okay.
But yeah. So yeah, they train cops show up. There's a fight, and then they basically lose the fight. They get thrown out of the train, literally, like sucked out the window.
Yeah.
And when that happens, the tempad is broken. So then they hatch a new plan. There's an arc. Let's get on the arc and get off the ship. And she says, well, in the timeline that I'm aware of, like the arc never makes it off. And he's like, well, what about if we were there? Maybe we could help pilot it or something like that. They show up and before we get to that, some major news drops. So they walk to the place where the arc is, essentially. I mean, it's got to be like many, many miles, right?
Well, that's what I don't get. Like, if they're in such a rush that they need to get on this train or whatever, I'm like, forget the train plan. We're just going to walk now. Like, did it buy them that much time? I guess it must have. But I guess it's enough time for her to fall asleep and wake up and see Loki drunk and singing. So, but it was convenient that they didn't get thrown off until they were pretty much right outside the city limits.
So they're talking on the way to the thing, and then there's a few big truths that are dropped, right? One is we find out more about how all this enchanting works, right? So we learn how she has to recreate a memory from a different time, and how, in the case of the person from the opening scene, she had to reach back hundreds of years to when the person was an Earthling. And so I strongly suspect that we're going to see more of this later on in the series, right? There's going to be some This feels to me like Chekhov's enchantment, right? Like we're going to see some scene of enchantment that is going to happen where some scene from someone's youth is going to be recreated or something like that.
Well,
But then,
I suspect we're going to see Mobius on a jet ski.
yeah, I mean, I called that. Not that it was the most revolutionary prediction, but she also reveals that everyone at the TVA is a variant, and this is an earth-shaking idea. This is something I think you were saying, like Mobius is going to find out like the true nature of the TVA, and perhaps Mobius was an Earthling, and his last memory before he got snatched up by the TVA was riding a jet ski. What do you think, Dan Gvozden?
I absolutely think that that's going to happen, and I think we're watching Loki, who is a variant, be brought into working for the TVA, right? I guess he's not doing it now, but ostensibly he kind of overarchingly is, and so we're watching that induction process for Loki. And I imagine all of these other people have gone through something similar before their brain was wiped or whatever, and their free will was taken away. And we had that scene between Loki and Mobius discussing free will, and Mobius suggesting, well, I'm as free as I could be here. But if the very nature of the TVA is one of like imprisonment, I think it's like I said a couple episodes, I guess last episode, that I think Mobius is going to have an awakening moment and turn on the TVA in some way. And I think also Loki will begin to question, like, what is this process he's going through? Like, is he, himself, in working for the TVA, being a part of this kind of, is he truly becoming their slave, if you will? So we're all working towards these ideas of free will, and to me, this was a surprise, but also like a really strong way of turning us back to the themes that are at the heart of this story. So, yeah.
Sylvie also suggests that her upbringing was tough because she fought with the TVA, and we already referred to that earlier, right? That it's weird that when she shows up at the TVA, it's seemingly her first time showing up at the TVA, but she seems to have fought with them for many, many years and know about them. Maybe it was many months, but again, upbringing, that's like decades ago, maybe, you know what I mean? Or at least a decade ago, right? So it's weird and the variant seems to be like a relatively recent thing, maybe in the Loki show. Anyway.
Can I get into really crazy theories online that I've seen?
Please.
So, spoiler that might not be a spoiler. I saw this really crazy theory online literally just before we started recording, that like people are suspecting that that Sylvie will be raised by Loki we'll see her flashback or whatever to her youth, and we'll see a much older Loki has raised her, and that's what she's referring to and why she's acting this way towards Loki. The more I think about it, the more I'm like, yeah, that sounds right. There's a couple of actors that I don't want to say are going to be in the production to spoil it. But like there does seem to be someone cast as old man Loki, if you were to speculate. So I think there may be something that we're going to reveal about Sylvie.
You're saying based off of casting news that you're not going to discuss, you think that, or you're not going to say who it is, but you think there is someone that has been cast that you think could plausibly be an older version of Tom Hiddleston.
Correct.
Got it. Interesting.
And I think that's why Sylvie is playing things so close to her chest, and she's like, I don't want you calling me Loki, because she has this really negative association with Loki in that she was raised in a really tough environment by a Loki.
There's some theorizing in the chat room as well as like online about the tempad, right? Like KS in the chat and a bunch of other people are saying, like, can Loki conjure a decoy time pad and fake the display to pretend the power is low? Like, maybe there's some chicanery or shenanigans with the tempad itself, perhaps?
I think that's entirely possible.
Yeah.
I think when it broke, he pulls it out of his pocket kind of cartoonishly. I suspect that as well.
Yeah.
But I also suspected back in Avengers Infinity War that like the Loki that died there never died. So I don't really know how to call my Lokis. So I will hold off on speculating too much about the extent of Loki's powers.
All right, we're about to wrap up and get to the final scene here. Before we get there, I just want to mention again, if you want to support me on this YouTube channel and receive a free, or not free, I guess, because you're supporting me, but a podcast version of this show with high quality audio, go to patreon.com/DaveChan. All patrons get this show in podcast form. Also, be sure to check out Dan Gvozden's podcast at amazingspidertalk.com and hit us up with any comments or questions you have as we're getting to the final scene in this episode of Loki. So they arrive at the city where the Ark is, and you see this gigantic spaceship in the background, and I think the production design is pretty cool. It's kind of this Blade Runner neon-esque aesthetic that it looks like a lot of work went into it. It reminded me, honestly, of the Cyberpunk video game. The most.
That's fair, yeah.
Maybe that's just recency bias, but
not to mention how we haven't really said about this. It's really cool how they do the moon kind of collapsing.
The moon is like getting
episode.
closer and closer, right? Basically.
Yeah, and just like pieces of it keep hitting next. Like when they're driving on the train or when they're riding in the train, it's like snaking through the mountains. But meanwhile, like giant pieces of the moon are crashing all around it. Like just some really striking visuals. And I think, if you watch The Mandalorian, you can kind of see that kind of the edge between like set and grand visual spectacle. But like even here, you can kind of see like, okay, that's probably where the edge of the set is, and they're walking on a dirt path, and the rest of this is all like CGI. But it's so well blended. Like you can really see the future of television in shows like this and The Mandalorian, that you can really have grand spectacle and have it not really infringe on the dramatics you want to get across. So I don't know. I thought this was all really worth pointing out, including this production design, which I'm sure only goes so far into the background, and the rest of it is really seamless CGI. So it's really impressive.
People in the chat are pointing out that I mentioned the city looks like the one in Cyberpunk. The game, it's called Cyberpunk 2077, and this episode takes place in 2077.
Oh, that's fascinating. I had not put that together.
Coincidence?
But yeah, no, that's clever.
Maybe there was a co-branding opportunity before the launch of Cyberpunk 2077 was hopelessly botched.
Yeah, or before like this show was delayed or whatever.
Yeah, there was going to be a cross-promotion opportunity of he's in the city from Cyberpunk 20. Guys, he's in the city. That doesn't make any sense, of course, because Cyberpunk 2077 takes place on Earth, but you know what I'm saying.
Well, maybe in the next episode it'll all glitch out and crash and everything, and we'll realize that this was all just a simulation.
So they try to get on the Ark, but there's a big kind of battle sequence where I guess people are trying to keep people off the Ark, and so they need to fight them off, and it all is done as though it's one long continuous shot. And as long continuous shots go, I thought this was a solid one. This is pretty cool. There's like cool stuff happening left and right. Fight scenes. Loki at one point prevents a massive pillar from crushing them.
Yeah, that was really impressive.
I don't think we've seen him do that. But then it kind of reframes the earlier sequences of like, dude, if he could do that, like, did we really need to see him like punch and kick people and get beat? Like if this guy can freaking Luke Skywalker massive pillars back into the sky, like he doesn't need to punch people.
I liked though how like the green magic blasts kind of fit in with the neon of it all. Like it was just kind of visually dazzling. The scene where they're like in the one shot where they kind of go into, I don't know if it's like a restaurant or whatever, and they're fighting the guards and blasting them into tables. I thought that was really kind of fun. And ambitious, as a one shotter with so many different things going on. I'm sure a lot of it is CGI, but even the choreography was really strong, and the way the camera swings around them at the end with the big reveal, of the Ark being destroyed and then their reaction. I thought it was all really well done.
So wrapping up, I mean, I think this episode didn't answer some questions that were revealed or didn't answer a bunch of questions that I wanted it to answer. Question one, what happened with all those Nexus events from last episode?
Right.
Like, wasn't Sylvie creating like a massive TVA crisis by like sending all these, you know, eraser charges into all these different timelines and creating all these Nexus events. But I guess we're not going to deal with that until next episode, is my guess, right?
Yeah, well, I read an interview with Tom Hiddleston where he said that his favorite 2 episodes of the show are episodes 4 and 5 because it's where the show gets its absolute craziest. So
I'm excited.
I'm hoping that we're going to get that in the next 2 episodes. And you know, based on the early trailers where you've got like President Loki and things like that, you know, I think the next 2 episodes are going to be a bit of a ride. And this was kind of a character setup. But to echo your point, in terms of questions, like I don't really feel like I know Sylvie all that much better by the end of this episode. And if this was kind of our get to know you episode for her, I don't know that I really feel all that much more confident about like who I'm working with. Although I guess I understand the dynamic between the two characters.
I think that's totally fair. And then the other thing is like, how do they get off the planet? You know, it's kind of a cliffhanger. I think, you know, we'll see. Weird to leave a cliffhanger on a show that's this short, in my opinion, where most of this, like from a pacing perspective, you know what I mean? Like not that much actually happens in this episode. So it's just weird to have a cliffhanger at the end. You know what I'm saying? Like this is the shortest show notes of any episode we've done together of any show. And so it's just like, oh, well, not that much happens. Surely you could show us the resolution of this one major plot line. But I guess we'll have to trust that they have a reason for withholding that information from us. Also, Hamstrong in the chat says, Loki lifted a building. Why can't they just they can't just lift themselves to the rocket? It's a good question.
Rocket's destroyed, but good yes.
Question. Yes. Maybe it was a good thing that they didn't, because it would have gone badly for them. So
right, exactly. Thank you, Dave.
Another question that was unresolved is remember there was like some confusion during our last podcast episode about what exactly the charges do and how they work, right? And I was saying, oh well, we're probably going to find out next episode. Well, we still haven't found out because we have no idea what happened to those Nexus events, right?
Yeah, I'm just not trusting any of your predictions now, David.
Yeah, I mean that's completely fair. I'm terrible at this. So okay. Any closing questions from the chat? Any closing thoughts from you, Dan Gvozden, as we wrap up right now?
I mean, I feel like there's still, you know, a lot to cover and we're halfway done. But, you know, I also understand, you know, if we're talking 3-act structure, you know, this is the rising action and testing of our characters. And I think a lot of the stuff introduced here it has built on it. So I feel fairly confident still about the track of the show. I feel like at this point in Falcon and Winter Soldier, you and I were both kind of like, oh boy, this thing is off the rails. And I still feel like this show is very focused on its goals and what it wants to do and what it's going to be capable of pulling off.
It's a terrible thing when you're watching a show and you feel like the storytellers have just lost control. It's a painful thing to watch, and this does not feel like that at all yet.
I have to say that when they used the word arc, I had a mini cringe because I was like, please, not another boat.
That's a Falcon and Winter Soldier reference for those of you out there.
Yeah.
I want to say a big thank you to all the folks in the chat room for joining us. Thanks to all of my patrons at patreon.com/Dave Chen. For supporting me and supporting this YouTube channel at youtube.com/Dave Chensky. If you want to get notified for upcoming episodes of this broadcast, subscribe, hit that bell icon. I'm also going to have my review of Fast 9 and some thoughts on that movie coming up very soon at youtube.com/Dave Chensky. That's Dave Chen SKY. So stick around for those as well. Dan Gvozden from AmazingSpiderTalk.com. Thanks for joining me today. This has been so much fun as usual.
Yeah, this was great. And I look forward to talking to you next week about the next one. And then we're going to be 2/3 done. Look at the way numbers work.
Amazing. All right. See you later, folks. Be well. See you next week.